So today I want to talk about a certain class of donor, which I refer to as the seller donors. These are donors that are trying very hard to sell themselves to you. They are constantly telling you about all of the advantages, all the wonderful things about them, why you should use them, how great your babies will look together, or whatever, which is not by itself a bad thing. But they are something of the used car salesmen of the donor world. They will try very hard to sell themselves, and every donor to an extent is selling themselves. We all tell you about a positive. The reason I discussed the fact that I donated my kidney is because I think that sells me as a donor. I admit it. But certain donors go beyond just mentioning, describing themselves, and maybe saying, by the way, here's some positive things about me, and go into really pushing all the positives, going out of their way to sell them. And it's understandable. It is an honor for any donor to donate to one for women. Of course, we should all be fighting for the honor of donating for women. And I need to stress, I'll probably say it a few times, the seller sort of donors are not by themselves necessarily bad donors. Someone can be a great donor who simply is also trying very hard to sell how great they are. They may be great, they're simply explaining how great. A seller donor isn't by themselves a bad donor, just like for all the cliches we have about the used car salesman, many people buy used cars and love them. Sometimes that donor is your best donor option. However, it is still very important to be aware of this type of donor, predominantly because it can be hard to compare and contrast donors otherwise. There are many donors who will be honest about themselves, will give lots of information about themselves and be willing to answer questions, and other donors who may be willing to answer all your questions in the world, but for whatever reason don't think to provide information till you ask it. They might be willing to provide you everything in the world if you ask, but they may just not come out and say much until asked. And these are also potentially good donors. The problem is that the seller donors who go out and tell you every wonderful thing about themselves can be hard to compare to a donor who gives you only basic information about himself and is willing to answer all of your questions but doesn't go out of his way to volunteer information. Either one may be the best genetic option for your child, but the seller donor, you have this list of all these hundreds of reasons why he's great. The other donor hasn't really said much of anything. It's hard to compare and contrast the two. So it's very important to be aware of when donors are selling and put an effort to normalize, so to speak, to make sure that you don't end up using a donor simply because he sold himself hard and pushed himself on you. So how do you identify a seller donor? I have a few things. This type of donor pretty much never mentions a negative unless you explicitly ask. They aren't going to be the ones that come out and say, my father died of a heart attack, that might be a genetic risk, or my grandmother has Alzheimer's, or whatever health issues. They'll be the ones that say, I graduated from a college and I have a bachelor's degree and see how smart I am. And they may not mention, but it's a really tiny college and the bachelor's degree is in basket weaving. Once again, I'm not trying to disparage. These donors can be great, but they do not nominate, they do not volunteer negatives. They only tend to say the positives. And if you're hearing a whole lot of positives and never hearing any negative, you're probably working with a seller donor. Another common indication of this type of donor is that they try to stress positives that really don't mean much as a donor. What I mean by that is they might stress what their great aunt did, but their great aunt is 12.5% of their genetics. It's not that significant a part of them, and maybe their great aunt did something great. It doesn't, and that is a positive, but it's only a small positive. It's not necessarily worth going out of your way to stress too heavily. So they may really stress comparatively minor things, and they're also prone to very general statements of positiveness, things like, uh, and I'm really smart, or and I'm I'm handsome, or uh, I care deeply about children. All these are very general statements. What does it mean to be really smart? Do you mean I got only A's and B's in in high school, or do you mean I have an IQ of 150 and I invented the internet? Um, what is smart? Until they give you a fact to define it, it means nothing. So one of the other big things you want to watch out for these donors is when they say very general statements without backing them up with facts. So you need to what proves what you said is true. You say you're smart. What makes you smart? What grades did you get in college? Or what did you graduate with? And what's your SAT scores? What's your IQ score? Have you done something that requires you to be very brilliant to do? Are you in a technically challenging field? Uh, these things prove intelligence. Saying, I'm really smart, doesn't mean as much. It doesn't mean much at all. There's actually a known psychological phenomenon that basically says those who are very incompetent tend to rank themselves very highly at a skill, and the more competent you are, the lower you tend to rank yourself. It's a very interesting fact, something Kruger. So it, just because someone says they're great, that doesn't mean anything. They need to back it up with facts. So when you recognize a seller donor, you should still talk to them because they may still be the best option. But there's things you want to do to make sure you're getting a fair assessment of this donor. For starters, you need to start asking very explicit questions, particularly geared towards finding the negatives, because every donor has a negative. There's no perfect donor. We all have some sort of genetic health issue. For instance, I'm ADD. Maybe, not really convinced about it. I may be ADD. That's definitely an issue. Maybe someone won't use me for that. And I volunteer that freely. But every donor has some kind of health issue. So what you want to do is you want to find out what that is. If a donor is not volunteering that information, as I've already said, give them a health questionnaire, start asking. With the seller type donors, you need to start asking very, very explicit questions to get details, because they are very unlikely to volunteer any negatives. The only way you're going to find out about potential negatives is if you hit them with exact questions. And I need to stress, seller donors aren't necessarily liars. There are occasionally donors that embellish the truth, but just because a donor is a seller does not mean that he is dishonest. He might just be trying to sell his strong points. That's not a bad thing. You still need to ask him explicitly because he may not be quite as fast to volunteer negative, but many of these types of donors, if you ask them an explicit question, will answer. Even if they have to answer a negative fact about themselves, they're not going to lie. And you still want to make sure you trust them. You still want to screen for honesty. That's one of my big four qualities you care about in a donor. But generally, if you ask the explicit question, you will get an honest answer. You just need to make sure you are asking because they may not volunteer otherwise. As I said, you want to really nail them down on general statements they make. You need to ask, how do you know this is true? How do you back this up? As a general rule of thumb, this isn't necessarily for sellers, but I'll throw it in here. If a donor says something really great about himself, consider checking it. I had a donor who once claimed to have run a lot of boxing championships back when he was in Russia. And I said, great. And he made some other claims, basically a athletic individual. I think he was the one that also swam some triathlon, or I guess one of them triathlon. It may have been a different donor. They blend together. But so I said that's a positive if it's true. But hey, that information's online. Find out what he competed in, and we can look up the date, the time, what he did, his name, pictures of him. If donors claim a fact about something they did in the past, there's a decent chance you can find proof of it. Get specifics, look them up online. So as long as you're nailing them down on specifics, as long as you are going in kind of the way you would for used car sales, when you make sure to still kick the tires and make sure the car is not going to break down as soon as you drive it off the lot, these donors still may be good options. But the biggest issue that I have with sellers, which by themselves are not bad, is that they sometimes are so large that they can hide sometimes better donors. I'm thinking of one particular donor right now, though I've seen many examples. This donor, I obviously won't name him, is not a bad donor. There's no major issues with him. Some minor things. He doesn't screen recipients, and he donates a little too frequently, which lowers farm count is not a great ideal. But he's what I would consider an average donor. Nothing exceptional, nothing horrible, okay. I would still say hold out for exceptional, but by no means is he horrendous. But what I've seen is there are some very good donors near him, and he ends up donating far more often than those other donors. And one of the reasons why is he sells himself to everyone. He's always posting about all his successes. He has many because he donates too frequently, but that doesn't actually create too fertility. I should probably have a blog about that. And he's always saying, I'm great, I'm here for you. He doesn't share much information though. Not a bad donor, but what I see often is a lot of donors who are willing to provide far more information and are at least as worthy of consideration that women talk to, they tend to ignore because this donor keeps showing up. He contacts them saying, how are you doing? Are you ready to do a donation? Here's all the reasons you should use me. He makes himself very obvious, very apparent, and women start just looking at him because, hey, look, he told me all these reasons I should use him, and I keep seeing him, why not use him? And what they end up doing is they end up ignoring what I consider to be better options, not because he's bad, because the other donor I'm thinking of happens to be a donor I think is particularly good. And that donor often gets ignored because he is forthcoming with information, but he doesn't sell himself. And I actually know for a fact part of the reason he doesn't sell himself is because he wants what's best for the recipient and doesn't want to so sell himself that the other women use him because he doesn't want to promise more than he can offer, basically. I won't name either of these donors' names if you ask me in person, because the donor I recommend doesn't actually want me to share his name. But the point is, there's what I consider a better donor that often gets overlooked just because this other more vocal donor is off selling himself harder. And that's what you don't want to have happen. You don't want to hear so much about this one donor, have him say all these wonderful things that you ignore other donors. You want to really narrow down what is this donor saying. You want to quickly exclude the facts that don't mean much. And what do I mean by that? I'll actually give you a perfect example of one I saw just a week or two ago. A donor, he was very clearly a seller donor in other ways, but one of the things he said I just found hilarious because it's so much the seller mindset. He had this statement, I'm not going to get it exactly phrased right, but something along the lines of, I'm also a vegetarian, and so not only am I a vegetarian, but so is every single one of my ancestors, something along those lines, the implication being, I'm a vegetarian, that makes me a better donor. And I found this statement very hilarious for a few reasons. First of all, does a vegetarian really make someone a better donor? Not that much. From a purely fertility point of view, vegetarianism would probably actually minutely lower fertility because you're not getting quite the right nutrients if you're very careful. But that's a very, very minor effect. The implication is supposed to be I'm somehow more morally superior because I'm a vegetarian. And I'm not speaking to whether it's right or wrong, be a vegetarian, but genetically, what does that offer? It's a very small aspect of personality. It's a good to know, but it's not an exceptional trait. If he mentioned it in passing, that'd be fine, but the way he phrased it was very much see, this is one of the reasons I'm so great. I'm so wonderful, I'm even a vegetarian. The other half of it The part that I really found hilarious was, and so are all my ancestors. That's impossible. I mean, is he telling me his great times 100 grandfather, while everyone else was off hunting woolly mammoth, was collecting weeds to eat because he is vegetarian? No. Someone, one of his ancestors, somewhere down the road, 200, 500 years ago, was eating meat. You can't say all of your ancestors are vegetarians. It's just not possible. And yeah, I don't think he was necessarily lying so much as he was exaggerating. What he probably meant is, and my parents are. But even then, unless both his parents and his grandparents are, saying ancestors is a bit overkill, implying too much. And I doubt that both of his parents and all four of his grandparents were vegetarians. Statistically, it seems fairly unlikely, especially because vegetarianism was far less common in his grandparents' day. Believe it or not, it has only been with recent nutrition that vegetarianism is really viable, because we didn't really know how to get all the nutrients we needed to have a healthy diet without eating meat until comparatively recently. So his grandparents could have been vegetarians. I think it's unlikely that all of them were. So here's this very grandiose claim that's clearly intended to sell him very well, but there's clear exaggeration. I don't believe it was lying. I think it was honest exaggeration, but clearly there's exaggeration in his words, embellishment. There is an implication of something that's relatively minor is a tremendous asset as a donor. He's really selling what is not a bad point. It is perhaps a slight positive, but it's nothing significant. And actually, to give exactly the example of what I would be asking in that situation, I advise that woman to nail him down and say, okay, you say you're a vegetarian. How long have you been a vegetarian? Were your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents vegetarians? Who was, who wasn't? Get the exact facts on who wasn't. Because what that does is it helps you figure out how much he embellishes. If all of his parents and all of his grandparents were vegetarians, then the all my ancestors thing still isn't actually true, but it's very clear to see why he would say that. It doesn't strike me as very dishonest. He just maybe was using a shorthand and didn't realize what he was claiming. But meanwhile, if both of his parents but none of his grandparents were, that's a lot more overselling in my point, because at that point he could have just said, and my parents were. It's just easy to say that as ancestors, and therefore he's really implying a lot more. And so by taking one of these over-exaggerations, these embellishments, which sellers tend to embellish a little bit, not to a lying point of view, but there tends to be a little bit of embellishment. Ask about these embellishments, get the exact facts, and figure out how much did they embellish, because that can be really useful for judging other claims. Some claims may not be quite as easy to tell. If he claims, I've loved children since a young age, it's hard to get exact facts to tell if that's true or not. But if he also made this claim about being a vegetarian, and you ask and you find out he was mostly honest in it because you got hard facts, and when was his parents, when were his grandparents, when was everyone vegetarian, then you can presume he probably didn't embellish his claim about loving children. Meanwhile, if you say, well, okay, how long have you been vegetarian? And he says, oh, I'm kind of vegetarian, I still eat a little bit of meat, and my mother was, but not really my father. Well, now you know he pretty strongly embellished the fact, and you have to presume the same level of embellishment in other areas. So it's really good to take a few generic statements that are easily backed up by facts and press them for the specifics so that you can judge how accurate / honest, embellished those general original statements he gave were. That particular donor also said something like he's great health, but after I encouraged the woman to ask more on health, we found out some actual legitimate health issues. So this is why you need follow-up. You need to figure out how much he's embellishing, how much he's truly telling the truth and simply selling the truth, but without over-exaggerations, to get a good feel for what you're really getting out of the donor. These donors can still be good, but you need to be a lot more cautious. There's perhaps also a slightly higher amount of actually dishonest donors in this category, but I wouldn't presume just because someone's selling they're dishonest by any means, and it's really easy to check. For all donors, not just sellers, if they make a claim that you think could be verified online, you ask the specifics. I say I donated a kidney. You ask, okay, great, that sounds like something that I could verify. Can you find proof? Which one I can actually tell you to Google the words true kidney, and you're going to find a bunch of videos on it. So yes, I can provide proof. But if I donated a kidney to a little kid, that's a pretty big claim. That's something that really says a lot one way or another if it's true. That's something that your first thought should be, that's big, it's something I can find online, I want proof that his claim is true before I go any farther. And you should be doing that for all donors, seller or otherwise. And a lot of donors will claim that they did something great in the past. Most common is some sort of athletic competition, triathlons, winning some competition somewhere. Those things can be verified online. If you ask them for when and where, ask them to link you to a site because they're more likely to know what links are. You can verify those facts. And once again, the biggest thing is make sure that you don't allow these donors to just be so loud that they muffle other donors. A lot of the really best donors I know are not sellers, which is not to say a seller is not good, but some donors are afraid to oversell because they really want you to have the best for you. I always say that it's perfectly fine if the recipient doesn't use me. I want them to find the best donor. The recipient is perfectly right to say, no, I don't want to use you, and by the way, can you point me to another great donor? I'd be happy to do so without any offense, because I want the best donor for them. And donors with that mindset don't tend to sell as much because they really want you to find what's best. They don't want to just make themselves sound what's best. And once again, this is not saying still speak to seller donors. Just because they're selling does not always make them bad, but remember that there can be some really wonderful donors who don't push as hard and don't let their voice get muffled by the more vocal individuals. That's the big thing I want to say here. Make sure you normalize, you get honest facts about the two categories and compare them. And don't allow yourself to get overwhelmed with 1,000 facts that are very minor details, like my grade ain't happened to do something great, and I'm a vegetarian, and I once donated $20 to a church, or things that, facts that are by themselves positives, but are minor positives. And don't just think because he listed 100 really minor positives, this makes him great, because there's a decent chance other donors, if they really try, could list a whole lot of the same minor positives. They just don't bother to. All those positives are good, but don't get overwhelmed by the number of them and think just because there's so many they're great. Consider what they actually mean to the donor. One really big, important, positive fact can be a lot more important than 30 minor, trivial, technically positive details. So that's all I wanted. Just make sure you keep your perspective, make sure you give every donor a fair chance, and you'll find a great donor because they're out there. And with that, I wish you good luck on your donor hunt, and have a good evening.